Dr. Shashank Joshi, endocrinologist from Mumbai, is popularly known as the editor of the JAPI, and he is going to give a lecture on these two topics. I welcome Dr. Joshi to present his lectures.
So I have to do actually two topics, but I'll first do the first topic, and I think Dr. Sahai, I should thank him for getting me here, and Dr. Kumar. And I think the first thing is an endocrinologist's perspective of preventive cardiologist was what Dr. Das was supposed to talk, and basically is diabetes a coronary artery risk equivalent? And this slide Dr. Sahai has already shown. The vascular burden due to diabetes in India is pretty large, and actually among all that, almost 1/5 of that is because of the coronary artery disease. And we all know that most cardiovascular patients have some form of abnormal glucose metabolism, whether it is glucose intolerance or whether it's over diabetes. And you can see from the GAMI study, which is the glucose tolerance in patients with acute myocardial infarction, it was 31% had normoglycemia, but rest of them, 35 and 34% respectively, had pre-diabetes or type 2 diabetes. If you look at the Euroheart survey, the prevalence of type 2 diabetes was 45%, pre-diabetes 37%, and only 18% were normoglycemic. If you look at the China heart study, it was very clear again, 27% were normoglycemic, rest had some form of glucose abnormalities. So is diabetes a cardiovascular risk factor? I think probably the answer is yes, and we had the classical Framingham data to do that. Now what about IGT or impaired fasting glucose? And we have the classical DECODE data, which very clearly shows us the association of post-meal glucose with mortality. So somewhere down in 1999, the circulation published this joint statement of ADA, NHLB, Juvenile Diabetes Foundation, the National Institute of Diabetes and Digestive and Kidney Disease from NIH and AHA, to show that diabetes is a major risk for cardiovascular disease. But it was only in 2003 that the ADA and the AHA got together to show it's a coronary risk equivalent. So probably what they said in 99 was diabetes is a cardiovascular disease, and these are the different studies which were linked to the PPBG and cardiovascular death. But the more bigger topic is that probably it is a coronary heart disease equivalent, and that came elegantly by the Hafner study. And the Hafner study very clearly showed the probability of death from coronary artery disease for people with type 2 diabetes with or without previous myocardial infarction, and that really made very, very clear delineation that diabetes is a coronary equivalent. So what the Hafner study concluded, and based on that particular seminal study, people felt that diabetes without myocardial infarction and prior myocardial infarction without diabetes have the same risk of cardiovascular death, both in women and men respectively. And based on that, they alluded to that diabetes is equal to an heart attack. Now, is diabetes having a different coronary artery disease? Probably yes. Multivessels, distal disease, difficult to revascularize, more silent ischemia, more in younger individuals, more in women, and their outcomes despite of revascularization are worser, like increased restenosis and probably overall outcomes. Also anatomically, patients with diabetes have worser outcomes because they have more extensive and diffuse disease. They have more multivessel disease, they have smaller lesions, longer lesions, highly stenotic lesions with greater plaque burden, higher incidence of left main disease, and the larger amount of lipid-rich plaques, which are more rupture-prone plaques, as they call it. And therefore, if you look at the CV disease and diabetes, probably 65% of deaths are due to the CV disease, 2 to 4-fold increase in coronary artery disease deaths in diabetics, 3 to 5-fold increase in heart failure, and 2 to 4 increased in stroke risks, and that's the diabetes situations. So if you treat diabetes, will it really change the risk of cardiovascular disease? And this is a pooled outcome analysis of various studies. The early UKPDS, Dr. Sahai alluded to, the late UKPDS, the ACCORD, the ADVANCE, the VADT, and the results have not been very exciting. Some of them say it's neutral, some of them may say, like ACCORD, that it may be detrimental. But if you look at the CV outcomes, probably there is a lower CV outcome. If you look at the mortality, there is no difference in meta-analysis, because these mega trials came out with contradictory results. Because the study designs were variable, the OAD backgrounds were different, the pooled analysis had to be controlled for gender, age, different subgroups like elderly with sensitivity to hypoglycemia, etc. were there. But the highest mortality with intensive glucose therapy was with VIDT and Accord, but both had the highest A1C reductions. That means you must reduce your A1C slowly. And therefore still the classic target with people with high risk cardiovascular disease is 7%, not 6.5%. And therefore they are now looking at multifactorial interventions, like whether it is the STENO-2 study, which was the most classical evidence base to show that it's just not controlling diabetes or glucose which is important, but the whole cluster of CV risk factors, whether it's the lipids, the blood pressure, the procoagulant state, and STENO was the most classical evidence. Therefore simple ABC, A for A1C and aspirin, B for blood pressure, C for cholesterol and cigarette smoke cessation, D for diabetes and pre-diabetes management, E for exercise, and F for food choices. And if you look at the classical recommended targets of blood pressure, 130/80. If it is renal impairment with more than a gram of proteinuria, it's 125/75. A1C target used to be 6.5, but probably 7% is what they expect it to be. And the fasting 108 and postprandial around 135 to 160 in type 1 diabetes. And the lipid cutoffs of LDL of 70 and the HDL cutoffs around 40 and 50 and triglycerides below 150. Encourage physical activity, encourage weight loss, try to get your waist down and have better dietary habits. And therefore, if you look at the continuity of the diabetes care team, okay, it's a whole healthcare team. It's the patient, the educator, the eye doctor, the exercise physiologist, the podiatrist, the dietitian, the primary care physician. So obviously, endocrinologist, when he's actually dealing, his whole job is to prevent the vascular burden. And if he follows a simple ABCDE formula, he actually can make a major role as a preventive cardiologist. And that is what probably Dr. Das was supposed to discuss. And that's what Dr. Sahai wanted me to talk on. That probably the endocrinologists and cardiologists have this unison of good glucose control, good blood pressure control, and the optimal lipid profile. And if you are able to do that, probably it is good. Now this is just a joke that higher achievers are always trying to be bigger, faster and greater. And now suddenly, when you tell your patient to have a lower sugar, lower pressure, lower cholesterol, I mean there is a challenge with most of our patients, but simple ABC, if you are able to achieve in our diabetic population, I think we can do the preventive cardiology role in a very big way. So I think that is what was the whole focus of that talk. And what I have tried to summarize is that all you need to do, if you have a diabetes, yes, it is a coronary artery risk equivalent, and all you need to do is just simple ABC. A for A1C, try to keep it below 7%, B for blood pressure 130/80, C for LDL cholesterol, keep it below 70. If you are able to do these three things, and then diet and exercise, D and E, I think you can go a long way in management of the cardiometabolic complications, and then probably you can save a lot of your patients a lot of vascular interventions, because they are not easy to do. But the biggest challenge is what Dr. Sahai alluded to, that most people think sugar is a very mild disease. They are very dismissive about it. When the same patient walks to Dr. Manoria's clinic in Bhopal with a heart attack, he feels that he's scared, he will have 20 relatives with him. When they come with diabetes to me or Dr. Sahai, they're very casual about it. They thoda sugar ho gaya hai. So they are not serious. But remember, that patient who's walking with that little abnormal glucose is having the same risk from somebody who's come from a ICU and he's had a myocardial infarction. Both of them are absolutely at the same risk to die. So it's important for our patients to recognize and our physicians to recognize that the mere diagnosis of diabetes is equal to a coronary artery disease risk equivalent, and therefore you need to be aggressive. You need to be aggressive in overall patient care, whether it's lifestyle or simple ABC management. I think if you are able to do that, you can definitely serve a role as a preventive cardiologist. I think so. That was my first talk. Thank you. Want to give me a second talk right now only? Because is there another talk after this? Dr. Muruganathan, I don't see him here. Later, so I'll give my second talk.
Yes.
Yeah. Any questions on this talk? Yeah.
So, what is the rate of lowering the HbA1c when you are hitting a patient? What should be the rate?
How rapidly you should lower it? Well, you should drop a percentage point, 1% drop over 3 months. It should not be ultra aggressive like the Accord. Accord was done predominantly in the US. It's a North American trial. They did not have a protocol for that. So the classical drop of A1C, but the higher the A1C, the faster is the drop. But if you have an ultra rapid drop, then sometimes it could be counterproductive. Even ACCORD was not a negative trial. Okay, it did achieve some CV outcomes, but the problem was that if you are aggressively treating, you are likely to get a lot of hypoglycemia. And hypoglycemia will trigger a lot of arrhythmogenesis and sudden deaths. So you need to be a little more careful. So you need to lower your A1C. There's no question asked about it, but you need to be a little more smoother in lowering your A1C.
What about the lipid profile? Because there are a lot of people who are between LDL 70 and 100.
Yes,
Their PC is normal, triglyceride is normal.
right,
HDL is between 40 to 50.
correct.
So we will be aggressive to bring it from 100 to 70.
Current recommendations, evidence-based, are to keep it below 70. Very clear cut. Okay, you should have a very clear, because you see, remember, statins have a role beyond LDL lowering. They also have plaque stabilization role. And as I told you, that diabetics have more vulnerable plaques. But I think the 70 cutoff on evidence base is pretty clear cut. So you should try to aim to go low. Actually, the bigger challenge in practice is to getting the HDL up, because that confers a residual risk. But you are right that you need to lower it below 70. Don't keep it at 100. A lot of physicians, there's a physician inertia to keep it at LDL 100 and they don't try to go below 70. I don't think that's a fair proposition. I think you should make an honest effort to keep it below 70. Cardiologists are very good at it. Okay. But I think the physicians and the endocrine community needs to recognize we need to be definitely keeping an LDL target of 70 and below, because that's where the evidence base is across the board. And we don't have good evidence from India on that, or as outcome based, but non-outcome based cross-sectional evidence does exist.
Statin therapy is supposed to increase the sugar levels. What is your comment on that?
Well, I would say that, those glucose increases or the so-called unmasking of diabetes due to statin therapy has been, overhyped. And I think if you are able to diagnose diabetes, treat them with anti-diabetic drugs. But you cannot stop them from using statins, which are life-saving. If you look at the mortality rates in the US and morbidity rates in the US, they have all plateaued out in the last 3 decades. And then you can see Senior Professor Padma Shri, Dr. Ram here now, because now the rates have all come in as a flat rate. And people are living longer, because they are healthier, fundamentally because they are on statins. So I think this is a little negative to physicians, that they think is statin liya. So there are 2 things which I often get. Formerly, 5 years back, they used to say, if I take a statin, I'll get erectile dysfunction. And now when a patient walks into my clinic, yeah, that is the truth, Ketan, and now when they walk, they say, no, statin liya to, they feel usse diabetes hoega. I think both of these need to be taken with a pinch of salt. Okay, for the endothelium, statins are very much required. For cardiovascular prevention, the evidence base on statin is huge. And I don't think there is anything which decries that. So I don't think you should get worried about it. Yes, there is a odds ratio. JAMA has published some very elegant studies at the ADA, at the AHA, showing there is a small marginal increase in glucose intolerance, number 1. Number 2, unmasking of type 2 diabetes in vulnerable populations. So we need to be cautious and conscious of that risk. That's mainly in high dose statins. Mind you, all those studies which have shown, they have used 40 and 80 milligram of atorvastatin or rosuvastatin. Now these are reasonably high doses. We know that in India we use much lower doses. But having said that, we have not done Indian studies. So it's not a fair comment to make either way. But I would still say that you need to be glucose vigilant on somebody who's on a statin. At the same time, you need not actually be overhyped about it anyway.
Which statin you recommend? Rosuvastatin or atorvastatin? Jupiter trial and all that.
See, the fashionable statin of this current year is rosuvastatin, because the Galaxy group of trials is there, but atorvastatin is as good. I think the simvastatin is on its way out. Okay, so predominantly it is atorva versus rosuva, and you can take a choice between the 2. Ram?
Yes, Dr.
One comment, Dr. Joshi has mentioned it absolutely correct. When we treat a chronic disorder, blood pressure, diabetes, lipids, arthritis, or reactive airway disease, when you treat any of these chronic disorders, trends have shown that you increase the longevity, and that is the reason why the percentage of people in a higher age bracket has been growing up worldwide, including in India. The longer one lives, there is a greater chance of experiencing diabetes, experiencing cancer. and it will be very difficult to prove biologically that what patient is taking is responsible for what you have developed later on. Last week, again, there was a little bit of jolt in cardiovascular literature about CCBs and cancer risk. CCBs, when they prolong life or whatever indication, none of these drugs are anti-cancer and anti-diabetic. I remember many years ago when Reserpine was somewhat of a popular drug, there was a higher incidence of cancer because we were prolonging lives. So this whole idea of drugs causing diabetes, drugs causing cancer, drugs causing dementia has to be viewed with caution unless there is a biological explanation. That's what my comment.
I think it's a very, very fair point, and I think that leads to my second talk. And I think, well, polypill, I would give polymeal than polypill, but you know, there are mini pills and large pills. There is still good evidence-based published on the polypill on cardiovascular prevention. But I think what happens is with people who take a polypill they should not decry lifestyle. I think the polypill has to be mixed with the polymeal or lifestyle modification. Secondly, you don't need one single combo pill. You can still do the same because treatment of an individual has to be individualized in chronic care therapy. So, you know, a person may need a polypill with 3 drugs, other person may need it with 4 drugs. Somebody may need a beta blocker, some may not need a beta blocker. So the 2 polypill is still an enigma. So we still, but there is outcome data, including India, on the polypill. But I would still put my bucks on the lifestyle and the polymeal and the poly exercise than the polypill. So having said that, I'll go to the next topic, which is
One more question.
Yeah.
At what stage we target about HDL increasing? I mean, to increase the HDL, the lifestyle intervention or drug treatment.
Right.
At what step? I mean, after achieving LDL or before achieving LDL?
No, see, the HDL target has always to be there, but HDL always has been in question, the most difficult to rise. Okay, the commonest cause of HDL being low is lack of physical activity and smoking. So if you improve physical activity and eliminate smoking, your HDL will go up de novo. After that, you only have niacin. Okay, beyond niacin, on all other trials have been negative. Anything else which has come in has really not been that popular. And HDL definitely is as important, particularly in the Indian community. It is important to have the right amount of HDL. And I think another thing from the diabetic standpoint, if you are a diabetic with low HDL, insulin and activity are the only 2 extra things which improve HDL. So that's something important. You are right. But our first target from the CV standpoint is always LDL. Okay. Second is HDL. And TG has been always controversially questioned. So that goes number 3 in that order of priority, in the triad. So I think I'll move to my next talk. And I think my next talk, actually Dr. Ram has really set the ball for it. What's new in anti-diabetic therapies? And you know, if you see the whole evolution, you know, right from Charaka Samhita or the Egyptian revolution, diabetes was described in the 15,000 BC. Then came the Langerhans identification of pancreas. Insulin got discovered in 20s. Now we are celebrating 90 plus years. And then we had the syringes. We had the Biostar pancreas in 70s. Human insulin, the pumps. Sulfonylureas came in 56. They're still alive. They're very much alive. Fenformin came in the 60s. And then fenformin was withdrawn. And metformin got approved in 95 by the US FDA. Alpha glucosidase inhibitors are there. Glitazones are there. As Dr. Ram said, they are now the hot topic in India. And then gliptins have come in. So he talked about cancer. And remember, as people live longer, people have to die of something. So they die of 3 things, either of heart attacks or vascular events, they die of cancer, or they die of accidents. So after some time, you'll also see literature that, you know, a drug will cause cancer or a drug will cause accidents. But remember, he said that there is no drug which actually makes an impact on cancer. There is a drug called metformin. It's a French compound. US FDA always said it's not a good compound. They did not approve it for 30, 40, 50 years. Indians used it. Actually, it inhibits an enzyme, we understand it better, called AMP kinase. And AMP kinase activation results in rapid inhibition of cellular protein synthesis and growth. So actually it's an anti-cancer drug. And you can see here excellent evidence base published in September 2009 in Diabetes Care Journal, where you can see people who took metformin, their cancer mortality came down. Just last week I saw a research paper published where they showed metformin has a very good role in prostate cancer survivors. People who took metformin, those prostate cancer survivors had longevity more than their doctors or their family members. AD in 2012 came out with a position statement and they put metformin number 1. The first treatment for type 2 diabetes is metformin, widely accepted, still there, still not out after 60 years. And it's a French compound doing extremely well, and it's added to everything else. After that, of course, we have 5 options. You can use a secretagogue, still not out, again 50 years old. Glitazones, under huge controversy, and I'll allude to that a little later. Gliptin's a new kid of the block, but expensive, and still has to go through a lot of pharmacovigilance. GLP-1 analogs, again very attractive. These are like newly wedded wives who are very expensive, and you need to be very careful and you need to handle them with care. But these are new agents, and I am supposed to talk on new agents. And then of course insulin, time tested, but what's new in insulin? But diabetes has 2 problems. Old drugs of diabetes cause hypoglycemia, weight gain, and that was the challenges with sulfonylurea, insulin and glitazones. But remember, diabetes treatment is individualized. Right treatment for the right patient at the right time. And we are not just looking at A1C, fasting and PP. We are looking at lesser glycemic variability, lower hypoglycemia, lower weight gain and better quality of life. So we're looking at a composite. So the hormone which got a lot of focus in the last decade was glucagon. Up till now we are only focused on beta cells. All the time we are looking at beta cells. Either you stimulate beta cells by secretagogues, or you give insulin from outside, or you sort of stimulate them by other mechanisms. But glucagon, which is made by alpha cells, okay, what does it do? It activates the hepatic glucagon receptor and it stimulates glycogen breakdown and gluconeogenesis and fundamentally elevates blood glucose. So we have drugs which are called as gliptins, which actually switch off the alpha cells, do not make glucagon, so the glucose diarrhea of the liver is stopped. So this was the focus of the last decade, and that is something which we all have now recognized better. So these so-called gliptins which inhibit this enzyme, they are sitagliptin, vildagliptin, saxagliptin, linagliptin, alogliptin. Many a time they ask me why are these different names, why sita is called sita or vilda, I have no idea. They don't cause much of hypoglycemia, they are weight neutral, they are very easy to use, and they hardly have any side effects, but of course side effects have become popular now. This is how they look. They are different types of compounds, they have different pharmacology. Like linagliptin, the only difference is that linagliptin is not excreted by the kidney, other gliptins are excreted by the kidney. So these are the new kids of the block. They have different pharmacokinetic properties. For example, if you look at aloe and lina and sita, they are much longer acting, while vilda and saxa are shorter acting, and they also reduce the mean amplitude of glycemic variation or glycemic variability and oxidative stress. So those are the oral drugs. The same oral drugs, when you inject them, okay, these are so-called the GLP-1 analogs. The GLP-1 analogs, they are again very exciting. Exenatide, liraglutide. Now we have new agents like lixisenatide, long-acting exenatide, and so on and so forth. And people are also now combining this GLP-1 agonist with a basal analog. So you use basal analog at night and GLP-1 mimetic in the morning. So insulins cause a lot of weight gain, GLP-1 causes weight loss, and insulin cause hypoglycemia. These don't cause hypoglycemia. Basal insulin will reduce fasting, GLP-1 analog will reduce postprandial. So you can balance it out. So you are trying to use them together. And we are getting once a day exenatide also now. Once a week exenatide is coming in. And in the west coast of US, they are using actually a pellet which can keep this exenatide for a year now, and they are undergoing phase 2, phase 3 trials. So they look very, very exciting, these new GLP-1 analogs, tespaglutide, albiglutide, and so on and so forth. But they all have got concerns now. This is the pancreas, and we all know that these drugs, whether they are GLP-1 agonists or the gliptins, they all have some modulation on the pancreas. At best, what they do is they probably reduce the apoptosis of beta cells. We know that even in type 2 diabetes, the beta cell mass is reduced. And there's a lot of apoptosis of beta cells. And the claim made by the manufacturers is they cause neogenesis. That means new beta cells are made. While Peter Butler from UCLA feels no, they cause cancer, they cause pancreatitis, they cause inflammation. So these drugs also need a lot of pharmacovigilance. So as I said, these drugs have very exciting, these are new, but you need to be pharmacovigilant because they can cause beta cell and pancreatic neoplasia. Whether it's a signal or a smoke, we don't know, but we are looking at it. So Peter Butler from the US, UCLA feels it's probably a signal. Bonnie Weir from the Harvard feels it's a smoke. This is beta cell neogenesis. These are new beta cells being made. So these drugs need pharmacovigilance, but very good drugs. No hypoglycemia, weight neutral or weight loss, you can give it injectably or orally. So they definitely have found some place, the DPP-4 inhibitors, the GLP-1 analogs and basal insulin in the ADA statement as second option. So after metformin, probably what's getting popularity across the world, if cost is not a rate limiting step, is probably metformin with a gliptin or metformin with a GLP-1 analog or basal insulin. These look to be the more popular therapies. In the Western world, I'm not talking of the Indian world. Indian world, probably people still use the time-tested secretagogue, and most of our patients do very well, but we need to be more vigilant in terms of hypoglycemia detection. And then of course, we are looking at the long-acting GLP-1s also, which are there in the statement. Now remember, India is a carbohydrate country, and we have more carbohydrates. So we have higher carbohydrate loads, and therefore we respond better to glucosidase inhibitors or starch blockers, and also our gliptin response or GLP-1 response is stronger. So higher carbs means better glucose lowering. So at a lower dose of a gliptin, we are able to get a better glycemic response. They are more potent because our L cells and K cells have a larger carbohydrate exposure. And Indians and Koreans responded better than Chinese and Japanese in a gliptin study. So lower dose of gliptins have done very, very well. This was a study, one published it in DRCP on sitagliptin, very clearly showed that in Korea and India, the A1C drop was 1.36%. Across China and US, it's around 0.6, 0.7%. So they are much stronger drugs probably in the Indian population. The more popular drugs in India and China, because we eat a lot of carbohydrate and fat and less of protein, are the starch blockers. The acarbose, the voglibose, and Dr. Sahay mentioned also that they are used in prevention. We have the starch study. They also can be used very nicely in the Indian subset and populations. Another agent which is similar to GLP-1 is an amylin analog, not available in India. It's called pramlintide. It is used for brittle type 1, type 2 diabetics in the US. We don't have it in India. It works very, very similar to the GLP-1 analog, causes lower hypoglycemia and reduces brittle diabetes. Another novel action is to look at the early morning dopamine levels. We all know that the suprachiasmatic nucleus of hypothalamus makes there's a reduced early morning dopamine level, and there's increased sympathetic activity, and whenever there is reduced dopamine level in the morning in the hypothalamus, there is increased sympathetic activity of hypothalamus, increased hepatic glucose output, increased lipolysis and triglycerides. So if you use a dopamine D2 agonist called bromocriptine, you can modulate that. And it was approved after rosiglitazone controversy in the US as an agent of choice. It's not been very popular, but it has been a good option which people can use. Next spotlight drug and the hottest drug in diabetes today has been the glitazones. Because of weight gain and heart failure, I don't think cardiologists were very fond of it anyway. They always had challenges with it because NYHA class 3, class 4 was a challenge. They also caused fractures. Concerns have been raised about bladder cancer, but Dr. Ram rightly said that probably this bladder cancer is more of an epiphenomenon. We don't know whether it's real or not, and there is also macular edema. Okay, but bladder cancer was seen also in the rats. In India, of course, you know that it was banned on the 18th of June, which has come out with the glitazar, but again, they don't have the outcome data on it. Me and Panikar did some work on the low dose pioglitazone. On 7.5 milligram Indian experience, we showed 7.5, 15 and 30. The A1C reduction was very similar, but the weight gain was the least in the 7.5 mg group. So lower doses in India again are quite there. So glitazones are there, they are not out, but you need to be a little more careful. Are there newer drugs which are still coming in? They are looking at the kidneys, they are looking at the gut, they are looking at long action. So the other drug which got approved this year by the US FDA is a drug which handles the glucose in the kidney. We also know that one of the major glucose transporter in the kidney is called as SGLT. And you can see here there is SGLT2. So you can see the whole tubule here which has been there, and every day, we excrete out around 150 liters of urine, of which most 90% of it is reabsorbed again. Okay, by the S1 part of the tubule and 10% by the S3 part of the tubule. And therefore, eventually there is no glucosuria. So body has its own receptor, a low affinity, high capacity receptor called SGLT2, which is there in the kidney for renal handling. This is almost exclusively expressed by the kidney. It is responsible for 90% of the renal glucose reabsorption. And they are trying to modulate or inhibit this receptor so that the glucose is not reabsorbed and glucose is excreted out. Now this is very difficult to perceive, this mechanism of action. And a compound called canagliflozin got approved. The DAPA also has got approved in Europe and might just get a limited approval in the US. at least the committee has cleared it, the endocrine and metabolic committee by the FDA. They have again got good reductions of A1C, they have some weight loss, blood pressure reduction, but they cause urinary tract infections. And there has been some incidence of bladder cancer and breast carcinomas reported with these drugs, but we are likely to see these drugs in the near future in India too, whether it's DAPA or canagliflozin. Another novel agent which has come in the market, in the US, not available in India again, is called as a bile acid sequestrant. It's called as colsevelum. Again, we don't know how it works. It reduces the A1C levels. It has a favorable effect on LDL and HDL, and triglyceride concentrations go up a little bit. And you can see that this agent has a attractive potential on cardiovascular metabolism. What about what's new in insulin? Dr. Sai also wanted me to talk what's new in insulin. And we had exciting ultra long acting insulin almost round the corner. It is called Degludec NN1250. Initially it was going to be marketed as thrice a week insulin injection, but the FDA didn't permit that label. Okay, good glycemic control, less hypoglycemia, less weight gain. It's a very good basal analog. We currently have Glargine, but we all know that most of the intermediate or long acting insulins have erratic absorption, they have unwanted peaks, they have higher fasting glucose, nocturnal hypoglycemia. So ideally you should have a no peak long lasting insulin reproducible like a pump, and probably they feel that this Degludec, what they have done is they have designed the structure at the DES B30 of this insulin, and they have added a glutamic acid spacer and a fatty acid chain, and they have made this so-called Degludec. So when it is injected to the depot, you can very classically see that the phenol goes out, and when the phenol goes out, typically the chains of Degludec, they all link as a single side chain, and you get a long multi-hexamer assembly there. So obviously when it is there in the vial or the cartridge, okay, you have the phenol, which is the first step, which will make it as a hexamer in the subcutaneous tissue space. And once the hexamer is in the subcutaneous tissue space, then the zinc will get out very, very gradually. So slow diffusion of zinc will release each individual hexamer, which will become a monomer, and therefore it will have its prolonged action. So it's a very, very novel new insulin about to hit the Indian market soon. It's already available in Japan and Europe. Again, in the US, they have found some cardiovascular concerns. They wanted to do an outcome study. So it's unlikely to come to the US, but India will have it very, very soon. This is how the Degludec insulin looks on an ultra structure. It's a multi-hexamer compound, very novel, and it's a new basal insulin which is likely to hit the market. So Degludec, Covalsalam are the other new drugs which I thought are a part of the ADA ESD position statement. So diabetes treatment has gone through a long way. I told you simple secretagogue, metformin was our traditional teaching. Then came a little bit of glitazones and alpha glucosidase inhibitors. But now we have so many other options. We have exciting actions which are exotic, like bromocriptine, very difficult to envisage, Covalsalam, and so on and so forth, newer insulins, and of course gliptins and GLP-1 analogs. So we have a big plethora or a menu of choices now. Beyond that also people are still doing things. Every time I go for a meeting, they ask me, is there something new in diabetes technology, like microneedles, micropatches, and people are continuously trying to do that. They are trying to work on the next generation analogs, which are going to be hepatoselective in signaling. So there is going to be a hepatospecific insulin, or the smart insulins, which are polymers, which will probably come in the near future. So they will enhance this so-called insulin release. The other oral compounds which are now undergoing development are called as glucokinase activators. One of them is called as prilaglatin. At the ADA this time at Chicago, there was a lot of papers on that. And other one is called as activator of a fatty acid G protein coupled receptors. Both the glucokinase activators and the activator of the fatty acid G protein coupled receptors, they are undergoing phase 2 and phase 3 trials in Japan, US and Europe. And therefore we have a lot of interventional points for glucose action, but people are also looking at personalized medicine. Now we know, and I started with metformin, I'll end with metformin, because whenever I talk of new drugs, I always talk of metformin, because this is a molecule which is probably the oldest anti-diabetic agent, still the first anti-diabetic agent. We are learning more and more about it. I started with the first slide and Dr. Ram made my job very easy. It's an anti-cancer molecule because it inhibits cellular growth. But we know that every 10 patients of metformin will have GI intolerance. Severe GI intolerance. You'll always get one patient. Okay, we'll suddenly know that somebody with metformin will have a ghost tablet coming out from the stools. So we do not know what is the response of metformin. And we will have this SNP chips, which is called as personalized medicine, where by a single blood drop you will be able to find out whether a person is a metformin responder or non-responder, whether he will be GI tolerant or intolerant, whether he will get a B12 deficiency or not B12 deficiency. And Dr. Das did some work from Pondicherry, and he was supposed to be here but he couldn't be here, to show that most Indians don't have this organic OCT1 genome chip abnormality which many others have. But remember, most of the patients who are metformin intolerant in our practice, or who get diarrhea, or who get GI intolerance, probably have this OCT, the organic cation transporter protein 1 defect in the genome. So we can clearly now find out by personalized medicine or genomic medicine which of your patients can respond, which of your patients can't respond. For example, we know that some patients, even with 8 units of insulin, will go into sudden hypoglycemia. Another patient, you may give 300 units and there may not be any hypoglycemia or lowering of glucose. There could be a genomic response to it, through the IRS1 pathway. So the whole era is changing to personalized medicine. So, we now are looking at, formerly people used to think that what we eat now is a problem predominantly of what we are eating in food. But now we are looking at what we eat now, probably looking at what we are going to eat in the foodstuffs. So metformin will still remain cornerstone of diabetic therapy, though I am talking of newer drugs. Secretagogues are under scrutiny. In India they will not decline, but in the developing world they are downhill. Okay, in Europe and America they are downhill. Pioglitazone definitely is on the downhill, though I think it will survive in the developing countries. Gliptins are very much on the rise and are on the frontline therapy. Longer acting GLP-1 agonists will be on the use. There will also be an attractive new basal insulin like Degludec. More and more people will come on a basal insulin GLP-1 analog combination. SGLT2 inhibitors will come and another option will come in. And of course bromocriptine, covalsalam, pramlitide will be used rarely, but they will be there. And also, as I told you, type 2 diabetes is a very individualized approach. Every type 2 diabetic is different. So you need individualized approach for every patient. Somebody may be lean, somebody may be obese, somebody may be insulin resistant, somebody may be having no beta cells. So you will have to look at personalized use of drugs. And in the near future, we will know who is a responder, who is a non-responder by probably a simple SNP or a gene chip technology. So what I try to do, because I wanted to do new therapies, is give you a classic overview of what's new in old drugs and what's available as new options which are already there. I have given just a glimpse of what's in the future because I thought that would be more esoteric. I have not purposely kept stem cells here because that's often asked, but Dr. Sahai told me just keep oral drugs and insulin. That was the scope of my pack. But I think there are no stem cells currently available in diabetes. They are all through something. Nowadays, there are different types of doctors. When people see, there is an endocrinologist, there is a diabetologist, there is a physician. In India, we have alternative medicine specialists. And now we have a new entity of doctors called internet doctors, Google doctor. I was just coming here, on the way I saw Google office. So most of our patients now, they Google out and they find out everything. So their Google doctor is probably the biggest non-evidence based, non-peer reviewed source of information to healthcare providers as well as patients. And through that, the stem cell has made a route. And through that, actually people have started asking us questions, what about stem cells? According to me, these are billion-dollar frauds. There is no stem cell in the anvil currently. In the US, definitely it is not there, and there is no such specialized Russian stem cell or a German stem cell which exists currently. There are some very good institutes doing work, like PGI Chandigarh is doing some work on stem cells. In Hyderabad itself, CCMB is doing some very good work on stem cells and so on and so forth. But there's nothing like that clearly in the anvil in the near future for us to say that these are reality. Okay, they are far away from reality, but there are a lot of other options which are available, which we are hardly using. And as I said, simple A1C control of 7% is all we want. We don't want a very aggressive control. We don't want it to go at 6.5, except special situations like a young individual who doesn't have any complications. And in senior citizens, limited life expectancy, even if you're at 7.5, it is okay. So we have enough drugs available, both old and new, for us to mix and match an individualized therapy. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Shashank Joshi, for telling latest things in treatment of diabetes. As this is a guest lecture, there won't be any questions. If the speaker wants to take the questions.
I don't mind one or two questions if there are.
I want to ask one first question.
Yeah.
Why the cost of these gliptins is so high? For India, the gliptins are good. Can we bring down the cost of gliptins?
Actually, if you ask the gliptin manufacturers, they'll say the cost of gliptin is the lowest in India. Because in US it is $5, in India it is $1. Now our dollar is only depreciating. Now they'll say it is less than $1. Last week somebody came from abroad, and they said, that, gliptin is less than $1. So I was wondering, they said, no, it's just 3/4 of $1. Now the dollar has appreciated to almost 60, 62 rupees, and the gliptin is at around 40 rupees. So that is how they were thinking. But I think, they are under patent, and we will not get new medications. Now there is a litigation currently going on, but even that gliptin, which is made by the Indian company, is only 30% cheaper. So it's not substantially cheaper. Most gliptins respond very well in India. So for our patients who can't afford, me and Panikar do things which I don't think if there are any gliptin manufacturers in the audience, they'll kill me. We tell our patients to cut the tablet of sitagliptin into 4. And because we are the low dose people from India. Okay, and trust me, that 25 milligram of sitagliptin does as well as 100 milligrams. So people who really can't afford it, you can do these mechanisms. At $10, people can go to a 5-star restaurant and pay 50 rupees for a tea or a coffee on an airport or in a hotel. But when it comes to a gliptin of 20 rupees or 40 rupees, there is a challenge. But there are patients who can't afford it, which is why even today, secretagogues, the metformin, the glitazones will stay in India. So over there you need more pharmacovigilance. You need to be more conscious of hypoglycemia. Gliptin cost, I wish it comes down, but I don't think it will come down. Currently, I think they are saying it is the lowest price. If they have a larger base, it's good. I always welcome, I call all drugs should be sundar, sasta and majboot. That means they should be good, they should be cheap, and they should be strong. So I think, I am with you on that.
Why the cost of 25 milligrams and 100 milligrams is same? Gliptin.
Well, that is why I said you should cut the tablet. You should ask them, because it's, not me. Yeah. But the glycemic lowering, we have a pharmacy student, just like we had a 7.5, we have a pharmacy student. 3 years me and Panikar are investigating by whether cutting the tablet, is it pharmacoeconomical for us in India. Okay, we don't have data from that research of that student, we are now analyzing it, but we'll have data in times to come. Like for example, vildagliptin is twice a day. In India, most patients do very well with once a day because we eat more carbs. So that's something very well known. Okay, stop NIDDM, Dr. Sahai mentioned on it. They use 100 milligrams TDS, dose of acarbose. In Indian patients, we will have so much of gas that nobody can sit in the room like this, If they use 100 milligrams 3 times, they will not tolerate it also. Okay, 25, 50 milligram are doing equally well. Okay.
Even though it looked like a little out of the place, but I want to ask about the role of surgery in diabetes. What is your idea?
Surgery currently is very good for bariatric surgery for people who are morbidly obese. As far as diabetes resolution is concerned, in brittle diabetics where nothing else is there, as a failed option, it could be an option, attractive option, not at evidence based, not through RCTs. So, but it is an option, but it's not a cure for diabetes. At best, the surgical data is 2 to 5 years follow-up, and you need to take it with a pinch of salt. The problem with surgery is two. Number one is there is no standardized surgery. Some people will do a balloon, somebody will do a band, somebody will do gastric bypass, somebody will do sleeve. In Hyderabad, I am told they do ileal transposition. So everybody has a different surgical route. We do not know mechanism of resolution, probably it's GLP-1 induced. So if it is distal gut hypothesis, there are two types of surgeries. So the distal gut is basically increasing the GLP-1. The proximal gut hypothesis is the ghrelin, because you know that the stomach mucosa makes ghrelin as a hormone. So they are cutting out the sleeve of the stomach. So it's called as ghrelin hypothesis. So you have a hindgut, foregut, attractive hypothesis, good research work. Currently, it's all in experimental zone. I don't think it is in evidence-based zone. Evidence is collating, and our surgeons, bypass surgeons, formerly we had CABG surgeons. Now we have this new era of bypass surgeons for the diabetes surgeons, they call them. Formerly they called themselves as bariatric surgeons. Now they've changed their role. They don't call themselves as bariatric surgeons, they call themselves as metabolic surgeons. And they're getting popularity. But I think we need to take it only in those difficult cases. Morbid obesity, clear control. I don't have any questions asked on that. They used to show that data. Diabetes resolution attractive. So in low BMI cases, I would still keep it with pinch of salt. Experimental, exciting, good to look at as a research protocol, but not as a standard of care. I do not recommend it for my patients unless and until it's brittle and there's nothing else left. It's an Indian company, Indian NC, so that is why they have approved it. Okay, and they have data. It's not that they don't have data. They have done Indian trials on it, and I'm sure they will file it abroad also for the same, because it needs a lot of money. But unfortunately, all other glitazar trials, and the last trial just got halted a couple of weeks back. So but as I said, we are living today in today's era. Insulin and aspirin would have not got approved. as a substance. Because you see the pharmacovigilance of the FDAs, whether it's Europe or US, both are equally bad or good. Okay, it's too much that they are killing real innovation. So I don't know whether these drugs are that bad as they are projected, that they cause cancers and they kill people, but currently the minute they get a signal, they just terminate the drug. So we will not see, now we were seeing a lot of molecules coming in, which are predominantly molecules discovered in the 80s and 90s. But now in the next 2 decades, we might see lesser and lesser molecules reaching the end stage. If you see the number of rejects of the US FDA, okay, the last couple of years have been phenomenal. Okay, they have just killed compounds one after other, and we have good friends like Steve Nissen, who are also called as molecular murderers, and their whole glitazone class virtually was eliminated by him. And now you know that rosiglitazone is back. US FDA, same metabolic committee feels it's safe compound, China never banned it, and now they feel it's a very CV safe compound. Just out in June, FDA put out a big statement on it, but the drug is gone. So I don't know whether they are that bad. I think the Indian innovator should take a lead and do CV outcome from India. This is something like Reserpine was originally an Indian compound and a very good antihypertensive for quite two decades. It did very well. Even now for refractory hypertension, it's still not a bad option. Of course, it has a lot of side effects. Similarly, the glitazone, India can take a lead and do a CV outcome study. It's not difficult. We have very good cardiologists. I think the cardiologists here are extremely powerful. They have a lot of volume. They can easily do a very good outcome study on the drug and do it. But of course, cancer has been another challenge with the glitazars, which they have looked at. And every glitazar is different. But India, because it's a NC from India, Indian FDA has approved it. It's not yet out in the market, but it will be out soon. Next month, I mean any time now. Lipaglinen or something. That depends on which company is close to you.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you for that excellent lecture.